Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello, and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 62, and in today's episode, we're going to be covering the Beyond Port Royal comic issues that were released by Joe Books Ltd. From 2016 to 2017. There were 4 issues in total that were released, and what makes these really interesting is that this comic series takes place right after the events of The Curse of the Black Pearl. More specifically, it takes place 3 days after the end of the movie, and Jack Sparrow along with his crew have actually not yet left the island of Jamaica. They are still in the area around Port Royal, and the reason for that is actually explained in the first issue of the series. But in terms of characters, all 4 of these issues involve Captain Jack Sparrow, of course, with Josh Gibbs, Anna Maria, and Marty. We won't see any other movie characters throughout these 4 issues. The reasoning for that is because the goal of this comic series was to flesh out the world a lot more, specifically fleshing out the areas around Port Royal, hence the name Beyond Port Royal. There are a bunch of new characters introduced in these issues, and some really fun moments between Jack and the crew. Now, I do want to mention at the start here that this comic series was never actually fully finished, as there were 8 issues originally planned in the series, but only 4 of those issues actually ended up being released. Why is that? Well, that's because the company that published these comics, Joe Books Ltd., actually filed for bankruptcy and went out of business. From what I found online, they filed for bankruptcy on March 1st, 2019, which is 2 years after the 4th issue of Beyond Port Royal was released. Now this begs the question, why were the other comics not produced in that gap of time? I have no idea, but unfortunately this ends up leaving us with a half-complete comic series that ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. You'll see once we go through the 4th issue how it ends pretty abruptly with no real conclusion. Each of these issues teases the name of the next issue at the end, and at the end of the 4th issue, we see the name of the 5th issue was to be Our Man in Port Royal. We obviously have no idea what the plot of this 5th issue would have been, but I would assume from the name that it might have involved Will Turner. I mean, who else would be a trusted ally who also resides in Port Royal at this point in time? We will never know if Will would have shown up in that issue, or better yet, if Elizabeth would have also shown up at some point too, but it really makes me sad this comic series was never completed. These 4 issues we have are super fun, and throughout the issues, you'll see small hints at the bigger picture behind the series as a whole, and the treasure that Jack and his crew are trying to find. But we'll talk more about that later. I guess having half of a series is better than getting 7 of the 8 issues and never finding out how it ends. That would have really sucked, but while it is incomplete, the 4th issue does serve as a decent ending to the series, as we'll get to in a bit. But let's start with the first issue of the series, which is named The Guardians of Windward Cove. This issue was released in September of 2016 and is the beginning of the Beyond Port Royal series. Like I said earlier, this comic takes place 3 days after the events of The Curse of the Black Pearl, and the Black Pearl itself has not yet left Jamaica for a very specific reason that we'll find out in a minute. And also because Jack is looking for a long-lost treasure somewhere on the island. So let's dive into this issue and see what happens. Alright, so the comic begins with narration that says, "It be 3 days since Captain Jack Sparrow made slip the execution block with the help of young Will Turner, following the battle twixt the cursed crew of the Black Pearl and the soldiers of Port Royal. Them that might wager on such things would lay good odds that old Jack is long to the sea making fast his escape, knowing the dogged Commodore Norrington is sure to be hard at his heels when the wind makes. But Jack and his crew ain't yet stole off the island, and they've an errand to make before they do." And we see Jack, Gibbs, Anna Maria, and Marty are trekking through the jungle, and Gibbs says, "I don't like it, Jack. Our business with Barbossa and his ghostly band of cutthroats rattled my timbers, and I've no wish to find meself a face of such unnatural terrors again." And Jack says, "While I will agree that walking, nay, trumping, through nigh impenetrable island flora is for gentlemen of fortune such as ourselves, unnatural, I fail to see the terror in it." And Anna Maria says, "Jack, we're making for Windward Cove. Surely you've heard the stories." And Marty says, "The cove is protected by old island magic, that's what I heard." And Gibbs says, "Aye, and folks speak in hushed rumor of its terrible chief, who calls up the very bones of her slain foes to serve as its guardians. And Jack says, "Stories, Mr. Gibbs. Nothing but stories. The pride of the local soldiers has been jolly well scuttled by years of unsuccessful attempts to bring the renegades that live in that cove to heel. Far kinder to their collective ego to blame failure on sorcery and our hobgoblinism than it is to admit being outwitted for decades at a stretch, eh?" And we see the group reaches Windward Cove, which is littered with dead skeletons, and Jack says, "Though the cove's decor does lend itself to fanciful speculation." And we see carved on a rock it says, "Let them that here died watch over them that here live." And Marty says, "The guardians of Windward Cove!" And Gibbs says, "I knew we oughtn't have come. Better to wait aboard the Pearl and pray for wind, says I." And Jack says, "Just a skeleton, mate." And I am, frankly, disappointed that a crew of mine would fall under the sway of such superstitious codswallop. And we see a skeleton is coming up behind Jack, and the crew starts yelling. Jack turns around and starts yelling as well, and they all run away. And all the other dead corpses in the area start springing up to life. And we hear a mysterious voice that says, "We who here died, watch over them who here live. Be gone, lest you join our ranks, and forever serve amongst us as a guardian of Windward Cove." And Jack notices a rope in the sand, and he pulls at it, and he realizes all these skeletons were just propped up to scare people away. And he says, "Bravo, love. If that magnificent display doesn't discourage trespassers, I'll eat me own beard." And we see some new faces come out of the jungle brush, and she says, "Well, well, Jack Sparrow. Didn't think to see you at our doorstep, child. Our guardians didn't scare you off, huh?" And Jack says, "Experience, dearie. No one spots a bamboozle like a bamboozler. Thus, I am not so easily bamboozled." And this woman says, "No outsiders come this way unless they have designs on our capture. But the Jack Sparrow I know is no blackbirder. So I gotta wonder, child, if you're not here to bring us in for a bounty, why are you and this bunch of ragtags braving the guardians of Windward Cove?" And Jack says to her, "I've come to put me hands on the map." And this woman leads Jack and his crew into Windward Cove itself. And she says, "I ought to have burned that map." And Jack says, "Not yours to burn, love." And she says to Jack, "Why would you want to bring that thing back into the world after all these years, child? Even if the map does show you how to find it. Just using it will cause trouble aplenty, and that trouble will get noticed. You know there isn't a king, crook, or captain alive who wouldn't sell his firstborn to get that thing, and you don't want that kind of attention." And Jack says, "If I had it, I could use it to keep myself out of whatever hands might wish to pluck it from my fingers." 3 days, Moody. 3 days of doldrums with neither blow nor breeze, and me ship lays poorly hidden scant miles from a man with no sense of humor and the full weight of the king's navy at his disposal. I can't afford to wait for wind. And we see a man begins to run toward the group, and he yells out, "Muddy! Just ran up from the root side. We were bringing in grain, and he had the drop on us." And Muddy, who is the woman who found Jack and his crew, she says, "Did he get anyone?" And this man says, "Maggie Kip and Charles and little Vic." And Muddy yells out, "Seth, you're with me." And Muddy, Seth, and Jack go out of the cove to find these missing people. And Jack says, "I can see that your attention is needed elsewhere, love. So if you'll make shed of me map, I'll get out of your hair." And Muddy says, "I'm not putting paws to rescue so that you can go treasure hunting, child. The bounty man who took our brothers and sisters is fast, and if we don't catch him before he makes his ship, we'll have lost them, too." And Jack says, "Too? Meaning this sort of thing is not an infrequent occurrence?" And Muddy says, "We make mischief plenty for the planters inland, and they've offered a sizable reward for any renegade brought in. The guardians of Windward Cove have kept those who try to claim it at bay, but this Shackles keeps to the trees, grabbing us up when we venture out." And Jack says, "That wouldn't be Mackie Shackles, would it?" And Muddy says, "You know him?" And Jack says, "Shackles was a pirate hunter before he turned his sights to renegades and insurrectionists. I myself once had the misfortune of ending up iron on a ship, and might never have made it out with all me digits had I not employed the use of a marlinspike, an old wig, and a 3-legged dairy goat bearing an uncanny resemblance to the governor of Hispaniola." And Muddy says, "Well, Shackles has designs on me, certain enough. My reward is more than 10 times that which any other renegade from the cove might bring. So he sits at anchor in the river, waiting for a chance on laying hands to me." And Jack says, "Looks to me like you're keen to give him said chance." And Seth says, "He's right, Muddy. You oughtn't expose yourself like this. Doesn't matter how many you save if you aren't around to watch over." Then a gunshot sounds out, and it hits Seth. And Seth says, "This is it for me, Muddy. Drag me back. Let my bones stay in service to the cove." And Muddy says to Jack, "Help me move him, child. It's only a few yards back to the cove." And Jack says, someone is shooting at us. And Muddy says, then stay low. They're shooting at pursuers, and we're not pursuing now. So they go back to Windward Cove and they bury Seth. And Jack says, I didn't really know the bloke, so if one of us is supposed to eulogize. And Muddy just says, help me cover him up. Seth was a true warrior. Some don't want to commit themselves eternal to the defense of their brothers and sisters. Better that duty foisted on our enemies, they say. Not Seth. And Jack says, I haven't the foggiest idea what sort of mumbo-jumbo you're on about, darling. But now that we've fulfilled our funerary obligations, mightn't I suggest we return to your impregnable village, wherein you can procure me map, and I can gather me crew before Marty ends up marrying one of your young ladies. Knowing Marty, likely more than one. And Muddy says, you've been aboard Mackie Shackle's ship. And Jack says, I have. Unpleasant. And Muddy says, we've snuck aboard ourselves, but saw no sign of our lost ones. If you've been his prisoner, you must know where prisoners are kept. And Jack says, I know what you're thinking, and I am not taking you aboard that ship, love. Savvy? And Muddy says, I would never ask such a thing, child. I want you to go all by yourself. And so the two of them then make their way toward Shackle's ship, and Jack says, Muddy, it seems that despite recent events, you've forgotten Shackle's propensity for firing at pursuers from cover. And Muddy says, we were making chase then, straight-lining it. Now we're taking the round way, and Shackles has likely already made it aboard his ship, making fast as prisoners. And Jack says, maybe we are in the frying pan here, dearie, but that ship is sure enough to fire, and I ain't one to see myself cooked, savvy? And Muddy says, I've pledged to keep safe any who seek haven with us. Pledged my soul to it. Now a dozen of those meant to lay easy under my eye sit chained and roasting below decks in a bounty man's ship, while he whiles away the weeks in weight of my collar. I'll not risk any more of my people on rescue, but I will risk you, Jack Sparrow. You don't have to help me, but if you don't, you'll never lay mitts on that map. So the two of them then make their way to Shackle's ship, and once they're behind the cover of a rock, Jack says, whilst I will admit that my reputation deservedly suggests resource and ingenuity beyond that of the average freebooter, even a man as highly esteemed as me? Even a man such as myself cannot be expected to sniddle pop aboard a manned vessel, find and release 12 cove folk who have already demonstrated a penchant for capture, and skimper off with nary a blade or ball making its way through me vitals, eh? And Muddy says, the vessel won't be manned, and she shoots her gun and alerts Shackles and his men on the ship. And she says, they'll be leaving the ship so they can get me. So Muddy runs off and Shackles and his men disembark his ship and go after her, which leaves Jack alone, and he makes his way over to the ship and goes below decks. And once he goes below decks, he finds the brig and all of the prisoners inside. And Jack says, hope you're not too comfortable, mates. And he frees all of them, and they all begin to disembark the ship. And we see Jack coming up from the hold, and he's singing A Pirate's Life for Me. And he says, Marauder and embezzle, and even hijack, drink up me hearties, yo-ho. We kindle and char, flame and ignite. And he's interrupted by Shackles and his men who have caught Muddy. And Shackles says, ahoy there, Jack. And Jack puts down the rum that he was stealing from Shackles' hold, and he says, Mackie, I was just reacquainting myself with your magnificent vessel. It's so... And Shackles says, the price on you may not match what she'll bring, Sparrow, but it's still worth my time to bring you in. Hands up, if you please. And Jack says, no. And Shackles says, what do you mean, no? And Jack says, I can lay aft on me boots before you can let me fall your flint, mate. I'll swing to the starboard shore, and the only way you'll catch me is by leaving her unattended. Bird, hand, bush. And Shackles says, if you thought that true, you'd have skipped the rail already. And Jack says, you may not have noticed, but through no fault of mine, your auxiliary prizes are no longer below decks. Quite a blow to the purse belt, eh? Now, as it happens, I've as much need of our matronly recidivist there as you do, and should you help me, then I will help you, and together we may just find the means to help ourselves individually. And Shackles says, we've laid anchor here 5 weeks on this score, and what she'll bring makes worth that trouble. There's nothing you could offer would change our minds. And Jack says, you can keep her, mate. I'd not begrudge a man of his fruits of honest labor, but she has something of mine that I very much want back in me pocket, savvy? So, I need Muddy to show me where she hid that little item of mine, and you need prisoners to turn a profit on this little enterprise. I say we make our way toward Windward Cove, from whence, our efforts in alignment, I will achieve my ends, you, yours. And Shackles says, Windward Cove is impenetrable. Even if the Guardians don't get us, its entrance is secret. It'd take time to look for it, time that might give, say, 20 or 30 renegades a chance to muster up and cut us down. And Jack says, "You're missing one very important thing, mate. I'm privy to the secrets of the Guardians of the Cove and its location of its village entrance. You leave with Muddy and whatever renegades you can round up. I leave with my item, and naturally, neither of us shall make any play to double-cross the other." So Jack and Shackles make their deal, and Jack begins to lead them toward Windward Cove, and they make their way back to the area with all of the dead skeletons. And Jack says it's a cave, or a tunnel. Cave tunnel. And Shackles says, "And the Guardians? You said you knew the secret of the Guardians, too. Seen 'em move all by themselves, I have, and no wish to end up bones on this beach." And Jack says, "Ah, they are not bones, pledged to the eternal defense of the cove, but are, in point of fact, an elaborate ruse." And Jack grabs one of the ropes from the ground and shows off the fact that all the skeletons are fake. And Shackles says, "That's not the only thing that's an elaborate ruse, Jack. Now that you've told me all I need to grab up these renegades, I might as well put you in binding too, as was my intention from the moment you proposed this ridiculous alliance." And Jack says, "I thought you'd say that." And right as Shackles is about to shoot his pistol at Jack, Jack slams it out of the way, and the shot actually goes right into one of Shackles' men, literally killing him. Then the other guy who's devoted to Shackles begins to fight Jack. And Jack pulls up one of the ropes from the ground, and a skeleton pops up and smacks the guy right in the face, knocking him out. That leaves Jack, Muddy, and Shackles. And Shackles says, "Very clever, Jack, but it doesn't matter. I know your guardian tricks, and I know where lies your secret entrance. I'll be back with soldiers, I will. You'll each and all be in chains within a fortnight." And Muddy says, "Oh, child, now you've done it. You've gone and threatened them that here live, in front of them that here died." And out of nowhere, from the water, a bunch of skeleton hands reach up out of the ground and grab onto Shackles' legs. And Muddy says, "Those puppet bones, those are simple tricks. Just play pretties to chase away the snoops and the riffraff. Those trifles aren't the Guardians of Windward Cove. These are." And all these skeleton hands come up and grab Shackles and pull him underneath the water, and he disappears. And Jack says, "That's unexpected." And he feels a hand on his boot, and he looks down and he sees Seth's hand reaching up from the ground. And he says, "Would you mind being the one to tell him I'm on your side, eh? As I said, I barely knew the bloke." And Seth's hand sinks back down under the waves. And Muddy says, "All right, child, let's get you and that crew of yours on your way, carrying off what you came for. I'd say you earned that map, though it'll bring you and everyone else nothing but trouble." And Jack says, "I can handle trouble, love. After all, I'm Captain Jack Sparrow." And that is the end of the Guardians of Windward Cove. This one is pretty cool and starts the series off on a great note. And as the title of the issue says, Jack and his crew come in contact with the Guardians of Windward Cove. Windward Cove itself is a secluded village that houses renegades, insurrectionists, and people being hunted down to give them safe harbor. And although it's not stated specifically, I would assume most of the inhabitants of the village are also escaped slaves. The leader of these guardians is named Muddy, and she does have some past history with Jack Sparrow. And Jack is after something that isn't fully explained in this issue, but we'll learn more about it in the upcoming issues. He is after a map that apparently is in Muddy's possession, which is why he's come to Windward Cove in the first place. And why is Jack looking for whatever this map leads to? Well, it's because the Black Pearl is unable to leave Port Royal because there has apparently been no wind for 3 days straight. And whatever this thing is that Jack is looking for, it is something that will help with the lack of wind. But Muddy agrees to give Jack the map only if he helps her free some people taken captive by a man named Mackie Shackles. He's a bounty hunter that specializes in finding and turning in these renegades. So Jack goes and frees the captives aboard Shackles' ship, and then lies to Shackles to form a temporary alliance with him. This of course leads to the final showdown, where Shackles turns against Jack and tries to take him out. But what we see here is the Guardians of Windward Cove are actually real, and the dead people buried there pull Shackles under the water, which I would assume kills him. But Muddy thanks Jack and promises to give him the map, and that is where this issue ends. So let's move on to the second issue, which is named Smoke on the Water. This one is super cool, so let's dive right into it. So Smoke on the Water begins with some narration that says, "It ain't unusual for Jack Sparrow to find himself afoul of the law and lawless both, but he's always been able to take his leave on the vast and treacherous blue when things get too hot for him. But there's nary a gust of wind to take him from Port Royal, and things be growing hotter for old Jack by the minute." We see Jack is hiding from a squadron of Navy Marines, and he goes and hides in a nearby building. And he walks through the building and goes to the back room where he sees Gibbs, Marty, Anna Maria, and some new people. And Gibbs says, Jack. And Gibbs says, Jack, do you know how dangerous it is for you to be out? Norrington's soldiers are all around, and if they find that we're still on the island, we'll be pickled pretty. And Jack says, unavoidable, Mr. Gibbs. We were out of rum. And this new character, who's an older woman, says, let me take a look at that. And she grabs the rum bottle out of Jack's hands and smashes it on the ground. And she says, I keep no spirits under this roof. And Jack says, the very reason I found it necessary to acquire me own. And Gibbs says, remember, Jack, we're guests here. And then we see 4 sisters, and one of them says, you are, true enough. And the next sister says, and that rankles me more than a little, does it you, sister? And the next sister says, aye, rankles me plenty. And the next sister says, gotta wonder whether our littlest sister can be trusted to make decisions, losing one of our boats to a pirate on her first solo run, then inviting the thieving scoundrel into our home while planning to take out another without having seen the first replaced. And Anna Maria is actually the littlest sister, and she says, if he's caught, he can't very well replace the boat he's sunk, can he? And we find out that these 4 sisters are Anna Maria's sisters, and the older woman is Anna Maria's mother. And one of Anna Maria's sisters says, our operation can't risk harboring fugitives. And another sister says, we're respectable traders. And Anna Maria says, we're smugglers. And another sister says, respectable smugglers. And Anna Maria's mom says, we spend a good bit of cash on a 5th boat, and there's too much squeeze on the company right now to write off its loss. We've got no choice but to keep Anna Maria's friend out of the Crown's hands, at least until he replaces the Jolly Mon and brings our fleet back up to number. And Jack says, so glad your concern for me freedom extends beyond the mercenary, darling. And there's a knock at the door, and Anna Maria's mom goes out of the storeroom to see what's going on. And we see 3 pirates in the main building, and Anna Maria's mom says, may I help? Oh, it's you. What do you want? We already paid this week. And this big burly pirate says, you may be paid somebody, but it wasn't the bowsprit boys. We run this quarter now, and my ledger ain't got your X yet. Anna Maria's mom says, I thought you chiselers called yourselves the Stingrays. And this big guy says, Big Sandy had a falling out with Slippery Jim, and the gang split. We're taking over the Stingray's old accounts. And Anna Maria's mom says, then you should have seen on our account that we already paid. And this big pirate grabs the nearby inkwell and dumps it on the ledger book. And Anna Maria's mom says, easy now. We need those manifests to keep track of our cargo. And this big pirate says, the cargo you keep in the back of the storehouse here? It'd be a shame if something were to happen to that cargo, wouldn't it? And so the 3 pirates burst into the storeroom. And the guy says, well, if ain't a flock of sisters, captains all at their supper. Your ma seems to think y'all needn't pay the safety tax. And Anna Maria's sisters say, we already paid this week. And the pirate says, that was the position your ma took. And the other 2 pirates begin to smash all this stuff. They smash some barrels, they throw plates on the ground, and this big pirate says, you built a nice business here, a family business. Nobody wants to see it go up in smoke. And we see this guy is carrying a cannon-like lighting stick, and he's trying to light the storehouse on fire. But a sword points itself at his throat, and we see it's Jack's sword. And Jack says, given that I find myself reluctant to leave this establishment, I'd rather no conflagration erupt during my tenancy. Savvy? And this big pirate says, I don't know who you think you are, friend, but messing with the bowsprit boys is a quick path to a broke skull. Boys? But Jack runs away, and one of the pirates says, you go that way. Cut off his escape. I'll climb, and out of nowhere a barrel falls right on this guy. And Jack, who is up on top of the shelves, he drops a whole bag of cornmeal on the other pirate, knocking him out, leaving only the big burly pirate left. And he says, get down here, you bandied scrambler. And Jack jumps down and begins to sword fight with this guy, and he knocks his sword out of his hand. And this guy says, Slippery Jim's going to hear about this. He'll have the whole gang on you. And Jack says, you tell your gang chief that if he's of mind to run this quarter, he'd best avoid confrontations twixt his hirelings and his more experienced blades, such as myself. So the 3 of those pirates leave, and Anna Maria's mom goes up to Jack and says, what kind of nonsense are you pulling? And Jack says, me, your bacon, saved. You're welcome, by the way. And Anna Maria's mom says, you think my girls couldn't have thrown those clowns out on their ears if I allowed it? It ain't them smashing a couple of crates that's the problem, you. It's what might happen when they don't have an audience. Now they're like enough to set fire to the place while we're sleeping, or sink our boats in the harbor while we're ashore. And Anna Maria says, we could barely afford the squeeze from one gang. And her sister says, 2 gangs are death on a small business. You can forget profit when you're doubling to the muscle racket. And Jack says, actually, the opportunities for profits abound, love. When 2 enterprises find themselves at an impasse, both will grasp at any asset that might grant them advantage on the competition. Convince either side that you are such an asset, and they'll burst your purse aiming to make you the instrument of their success. And Gibbs says, Jack, I hope you're not thinking what I'm thinking you be thinking. And Jack says, what I'm thinking is that I spent me last coin on a bottle of rum with which Anna Maria's surprisingly inhospitable mother saw fit to soak her floorboards. And Gibbs says, we don't need cash, Jack. We've got a jolly boat. So let's lay away from this island and worry about money when we're not in danger of being discovered by Norrington. And Jack says, Mr. Gibbs, the boat is notably short on provisions, and if we want provisions, we'll need coin. You lot ready the boat that Anna Maria's family oh so generously lent to us for departure, and be ready to make off on quick notice. If I understood that short-sworded reprobate, these bowsprit boys intend to seize control of the block from the Stingrays. And Anna Maria says, Jack, the soldiers are still about, Jack. Where are you going? And Jack says, to find these Stingrays, love. Then we go to the home base of the Stingrays gang, where they're all betting on 2 crabs who are fighting with knives, which is pretty hilarious. But Jack makes his entrance and he throws down one of the guys to get their attention. And he says, I hear there's a new gang making a muscle in on territory that was, unfortunately, quite recently, undisputedly under your control. And one of the Stingrays says, yeah? What's that got to do with you? And Jack says, I'm the one who's going to put you back on top. And then we go over to the port where we see the Bowsprit boys and Slippery Jim. And the big burly pirate from earlier says, I'm telling you boys, if we don't answer this, then there ain't a soul will pay up. What kind of a gang would we be then? And Slippery Jim says, we've got more trouble than shopkeepers refusing to pony up. And the Bowsprit boys look over to the dock and they see Jack and all the Stingrays following behind him. And Slippery Jim says, so it's finally come to it. A brawl to end the stalemate. And the big burly pirate says, that's him, Jim. That's the one from the storehouse. And Jack says, I suspect that they positively quake with terror at the sight of one who bested 3 of theirs, leading such a stalwart and determined band of ruffians. So let us be merciful, temporarily. And one of the Stingrays says, you said you was going to lead us into battle. Mercy ain't battle. And Jack says, temporarily. And he goes over to talk to Slippery Jim. And Jack says, might I deduce from your vicious complexion that you are the gang leader known aptly as Slippery Jim? And Slippery Jim says, I'm Jim. And I hear you're the one who made trouble for 3 of my men. And Jack says, no trouble on my end. Easy as breadfruit to send 'em packing, and with nary a serious injury on their person, save the chap still stuck in that barrel. This unruly and or violent band at my back is here with a single purpose, to engage in vicious combat and do all in its power to wipe your lot from the very face of the waterfront. To that end, they have offered me 20 doubloons to see to it that I repeat my performance from the storehouse, but with less concern for that well-being of your compatriots that I previously demonstrated. Savvy? And Jack walks over to the Stingrays and says, they offered me 30 to sit it out. And Jack gets out of the way and he says, well, fight! And right before both gangs are about to fight, we hear a voice that says, hold there! Brawling is illegal in Port Royal. You're all under arrest. And both the Bowsprit boys and the Stingrays then gang up on this squadron of Navy Marines, and a giant brawl begins to break out on the dock, and Jack slips away while the chaos is unfolding. But the big burly pirate from earlier sees Jack escape, and he chases after him. We go back to Gibbs, Marty, and Anna Maria, who are readying the boat that Anna Maria's mother oh so graciously gave to them. And Marty says, I ain't looking forward to rowing, I can tell you that. And Gibbs says, having to put arm to oar is the least of our worries. I don't know how Jack thinks we're going to slip out unnoticed. Even if Norrington's ship can't follow us without wind, it'd be able to turn its guns to us if it spots us rowing out and gets suspicious. And then Jack appears and says, I am confident that we will find an avenue by which to create a distraction. Your gangster troubles are over, methinks. They did not, as I'd intended, do away with each other, but I expect that they can do little mischief to your shipping company from inside a jail cell. Anna Maria says, please tell me that you didn't stop on the way back here to buy more rum. And Jack says, not just any rum. This is easily the strongest brew in Port Royal. Last time I had it, I drank it near a candle and bloodied near singed off me eyebrows. I'd say I've earned it after a day like today. But a knife appears at Jack's throat, and he sees it's the big burly pirate from the Bowsprit Boys and a few of his men. And this big guy says, "I'd say you've earned a blade twixt the ribs, but we're going to take our time on that." And Jack says, "Ah, looks as though you've put aside your differences, eh?" And the pirate says, "There ain't enough of us left to quarrel, not after your little stunt. Move." And so they all take Jack, but they leave Gibbs, Anna Maria, and Marty for some reason. And the pirate says, "Saw you slipping off all sneaky, friend. I think you were more worried about being spotted by those soldiers than you were running afoul of us. We was trying to figure out why that might be, and we reckoned that maybe you's the pirate escaped the gallows a few days back. We reckon you must be Jack Sparrow." And Jack says, "Captain, Jack Sparrow, Captain." And the pirate says, "Well, Captain, there's a sizable reward on you, and we mean to collect it, after we've carved a few pieces off you as recompense for the trouble you've put us through today." And while they're backing Jack onto this nearby ship, he's actually leaking the container of rum he's carrying, so it's dripping all over the ground. And Jack says, "Looks to me like today's events have elevated you to a leadership role in this merry band. I would think that, happy in your new position, you would be willing to overlook any offenses wrought by one to whom you likely owe your newfound authority." And the pirate says, "You'd be wrong." And Jack drops the rum on the deck of the ship. And he says, "It's the heat, isn't it? Heat like this tends to make otherwise rational individuals irritable and considerably less forgiving than they might otherwise be in more favorable climactic circumstances. And I suspect that carrying a lit slow match all the time probably makes it worse." And the pirate says, "It ain't the dry hot what makes me unforgiving, friend." And Jack says, "Maybe not, mate, but it is that dry hot that makes neglected sloops and rope-laden warehouses particularly flammable." And he blows on the match the guy's holding right in front of his face, and the lit match drops on all the rum that Jack was leaking on the ground, and it begins to light a massive fire over everywhere that it spilled. And Jack says, "At least when fueled by unhealthily strong rum. Looks like you're the ones whose business is set to go up in smoke, mate." And all the pirates are trying to get the fire out, and Jack jumps off the ship and swims back over to the boat where the rest of the crew is. And Gibbs says, "Odds bobs, Jack, did you have to set fire to the dockside to make your escape? It'll bring every soldier and navyman to the port right here." And Jack says, "Ah, but we won't be here, Mr. Gibbs. We will be rowing south-southeast in order to take advantage of that attention that this inferno is certain to garner from Norrington's men. We should catch the trade currents a mile or so out, and be well on our way to retrieving a certain item long coveted by every cutthroat that ever sailed the blue. What could possibly go wrong?" And that is the end of Smoke on the Water. The coolest thing about this issue is we find out a lot about Anna Maria, that being that she is one of 5 children. We see Anna Maria's mother and her 4 older sisters at the beginning of this issue, and Anna Maria is apparently the youngest of her siblings. Anna Maria's family actually runs a smuggling company, and they own a few small boats. One of these boats, as we find out, was the Jolly Mon, which, if you don't know, is the name of the boat that Jack sails in on at the beginning of The Curse of the Black Pearl. Of course, the Jolly Mon sank, and Anna Maria's family is pretty angry with her about this. This makes perfect sense with Anna Maria telling Jack and Tortuga that he stole her boat, and I love that we get this expansion on her character in this comic. Anna Maria is a really awesome character, and it is a shame that she only appeared in one movie. However, she has appeared in all kinds of other Pirates media, like the Disney Adventures comics, these comics we're talking about today, and she even appeared in the Sea of Thieves Pirates of the Caribbean crossover, A Pirate's Life, which, yes, we will cover eventually. I know a lot of people have been waiting for that. But getting to find out about Anna Maria's family is really, really cool, and although we don't get any of the names of her sisters or her mother's name, it is still awesome to get this extension of her character. Anyway, Anna Maria's mother has been paying dues to the local gang who owns the territory where their family business is located, and the gang they have been paying has actually split up into another gang, which has taken over the territory. So Jack decides to go and solve this problem, and he pays a visit to Slippery Jim, the leader of the Bowsprit Boys. Long story short, Jack causes a ruckus and manages to slip away, and outsmarts the other gang members who capture him. And the issue ends with Jack, Gibbs, Anna Maria, and Marty sailing off on another one of Anna Maria's family's boats to get closer to finding the thing that Jack is so intent on trying to find. But next up is Banshee's Boon, the 3rd issue in the series, so let's jump into that one. So the comic begins with some more narration that says, "Pirates live each day as though it be their last, for many a ship be lost at sea, with nary a soul to recount her passing. Some sailors think it bad luck to bear witness to such tragedy, as it stands reminder of the sea's lethal learnings and burdens him who saw it with the memories of them what perished. But Jack Sparrow has seen tragedy 100 times over, and thinks his luck of his own making. So Jack and the crew come up to a sinking ship, and they hear wailing from below decks. And Gibbs says, "Unnatural wailing, that." And Marty says, "Natural enough. You'd wail too if you was sinking to the seafloor." Gibbs says, "Anyone planning a rescue?" And Anna Maria begins to get ready to go over to the ship, and Jack says, "I wouldn't do that, love." And Anna Maria says, "Yes, you would. You dove into the water to save Elizabeth Swan when she fell into the bay. This is no different." And Jack says, "Swan was wrapped in a dress. This one is wrapped in a ship. I cannot allow a third of my crew to board a vessel when that vessel is rapidly becoming less floaty." And Gibbs says, "Jack, take in her signage. She's out of San Silvestri. More to the point, she could be our way into it." And Anna Maria says, "Our map leads us past San Silvestri's canal lock, but the customs agent there is notoriously incorruptible. Would have meant trouble, but..." And Marty says, "But if we had our papers, we could bluff our way past the customs agent, easy as octopus pie." And Jack says, "Excellent point, Marty. Rescue away, Anna Maria. Just lay hands on the Carlo's papers whilst aboard, eh?" And Anna Maria says, "I was only going because nobody else would. That thing's a death trap, certain." And Jack says, "We need those papers, darling, and as captain of this intrepid band, I must insist." And Anna Maria says, "You're captain of the Pearl, Jack, and we aren't on the Pearl. This is my boat, so if anyone is to give orders, it'll be me." And Jack sighs and says, "Semantics," and he goes over to the sinking ship and goes into the captain's cabin. And we hear a voice call out to Jack, and he says, Who's there? Come back to finish me off, have ye?" And we see the guy who has been wailing is this guy who has a sword stabbed into his chest. And Jack says, "You've mistaken me for someone else, mate. I had no part in your misfortunes. We were just passing by and couldn't help but notice your shrill and decidedly feminine wailing. Thought a rescue was the order of the day. Do unto others, etc." And the guy says, "'Tweren't I that was a wailin'." And Jack says, "Even the stoutest hand earns the right to blubber when pinned through the brisket," says I. "No shame in it. Now let's see if we can't..." And the guy says, "Don't trouble to move me, friend. I'm a croaker, certain. Me limbs are limp, me eyes are dark. Only part of me still working is me throat, which burns with thirst." And Jack grabs a nearby rum bottle and gives the man a drink. And the guy thanks him before he dies. And right after that, the wailing returns, and Jack is greeted by a banshee. And the banshee says, "The world has lost a good man. Whoa, whoa." And Jack says, "A right tragedy, love, but it'll lose us too if we don't make our exit." And the banshee grabs Jack's wrist, and she says, "You gave him comfort in his final moments." And Jack says, "Least I could do." And the banshee says, "For your kindness, I shall leave you with his blessing. May his greatest strength be yours as you carry him away." And Jack says, "Hate to break it to you, darling, but carrying him wouldn't do much good now." And he turns back and sees the banshee has disappeared. And he goes back outside to get back on the boat. And Marty says, "It's not bigamy if you only used your real name in one wedding." And Jack says, "Where'd she go?" And Gibbs says, "No one came out but you, Jack." And Jack says, "A smidge nearer, Mr. Gibbs." And they bring the boat closer, and Jack hops on board. And Marty says, "There was a woman aboard." And Anna Maria says, "Why didn't you save her?" And Jack says, "I would have done, but she vanished." And Gibbs says, "Vanished? Odds bobs, Jack, you mean to say there was some manner of enchantress aboard?" And Jack says, "She wasn't very enchanting." And Marty says, "Did she say anything?" And Jack says, "Wailed over the dying of an Irishman and offered me a blessing. Not much of a conversationalist, that one." And Gibbs says, "Jack, the wailing, the preternatural disappearance, the ethnicity of the man of whom she grieved. 'Twas a banshee." And Jack says, "Usually in a situation like this, Mr. Gibbs, I would humbug your suggestion as nothing but fairy rhymes and figments, but I wholeheartedly believe your assessment. I generally do, though I sometimes scoff to appear worldly and aloof, and so that I wouldn't come off as foolish should you be wrong." And Gibbs just gives Jack a look, and it's so funny. But Anna Maria asks, "What's a banshee?" And Gibbs says, "It's a she-creature that alights on the good when they die, if they've no loved ones about to mourn their passing. They wail as a testament to the world's sorrow to see such figures pass away. Pirates don't often encounter them because, well, we are not good. In any case, she carries the souls of the good dead until the setting sun grants them passage to the world beyond." And Jack says, "Question, Mr. Gibbs, do these banshees ever delegate the task of carrying souls to a third party?" And Gibbs says, "What do you mean, Jack?" And Jack says, "The blessing of which I was an unwilling recipient said, 'May his strength be yours as you carry him away.' Does that mean I have a ghost and piggyback of whose presence I am thankfully unaware?" And Gibbs says, "Some say a man who sinks beneath the seas can't make his way across the veil till the day of his judgment comes, Jack. I reckon she saw you as a vessel to keep his spirit afloat. A man good enough to warrant a banshee ought rightly find himself on the fast road to paradise, not stuck on the seafloor till the end of days." And Jack says, "And that bit about his strength being my strength?" And Marty says, "Maybe you're double strong." And Jack goes and tries to lift Gibbs up, but he's unsuccessful. And he says, "Any other hypotheses?" And Anna Maria says, "Maybe you have a special ability that man possessed. Perhaps he was good at algebra, or could speak Hindi, or was an expert juggler." And Marty says, "Got a feeling as to what it might be, Captain?" And Jack says, "Tough to keep track of what's already in here, mate. If I am in possession of a new skill and or logical powers, it is unlikely that I shall realize it until our situation calls for their employ. In the meantime, however, I have acquired a boon of more immediate use." And Anna Maria says, "The ship's papers." And Jack says, "With these in hand, we'll slip through lickety-spittle and be upriver by the time our bellies call for supper, eh?" Then we go over to the canal lock in San Silvestri, and the customs agent says, "This says you're affiliated with the Carlo?" And Jack says, "It does." And the customs agent says, "The Carlo berths here, and I've never seen you, your crew, or this boat." And Jack says, "That's because we're not really affiliated with her." And realizing what he just said, Jack covers his mouth, surprised, and the customs agent says, "I'm sorry?" And Jack says, "I lifted her papers so we could trick you into letting us pass without having to divulge our true identities, mate." And the other guy who's standing here says, "What identities?" And Jack says, "We're pirates, ne'er-do-well scoundrels, really bad eggs." And Anna Maria yells out, "Jack!" And a bunch of the workers then come out, and the customs agent says, "And you got these papers?" And Jack says, "From aboard the Carlo, before it sunk." "Don't worry, mate, everyone was already dead." And all the workers say, "Seize the murderous swine, boys. We'll lock 'em up in the brewery till we can rig up some gallows." And once they're all locked in, Gibbs says, "Scupper me mutton, Jack. What were you thinking?" And Jack says, "Couldn't help myself." And Anna Maria says, "Well, we're in a tight spot now. These company men are ready to string us up." And Marty says, "Hear that hammering? That's our gallows, Captain." And then outside, we see the customs agent talking to that other guy from earlier, and he says, "You told me that you sunk the Carlo after killing Shalvey and the crew." And the guy says, "It was sinking. I weren't going to wait for 2 hours. I had to row all the way back here." And the customs agent says, "And what if a different ship had come across her? Pirates can shoulder the blame for a crew's slaughter, true. But what would have happened if a respectable vessel found her? The unimpeachable customs agent of San Silvestri murdered on his way to give the company a report on his subordinate's suspected financial mismanagement? Mighty suspicious, sir." And this other guy says, "Well, it was pirates what found him, and that gives you a better story than the ship just disappearing in light weather." And the customs agent says, "The gallows are nearly ready. Bring them down one at a time, and we'll put to end this whole business and get back to lining our pockets, eh?" And the guy turns around and says, "You two, come on. We're bringing down their captain." And they go over to where the crew is being held, and they grab Jack and bring him out. And the two guys that are holding on to Jack says, "Curse your soul, you bloody pirate. Murdering poor old Mr. Shalvey like you done. A right honor it was, working for him. The company's full of reprobates and pilchers, but he was an officer you could trust. The most honest man in the West Indies, I'd wager." And Jack says, "Honesty. That's the strength of which I'm possessed. Honesty. Magical lady creature saddled me with it. Long story, can't lie." And the guy says, "He ain't just a killer, he's mad to boot." And Jack knocks both of these guys away and begins to try to make his escape. And he jumps onto a stack of nearby barrels, and the guy in charge jumps on the barrels as well and pulls out a knife. And Jack says, "Oh, come on, mate. You haven't got a chance with that thing. Forget to fill your scabbard this morning?" And the guy says, "I left it buried in the last fella saw fit to cross me, just as I'll leave this buried in you." And the two of them begin to fight, and Jack says, "I'm actually quite concerned about the outcome of this engagement. You're better at this sort of thing than I figured." And the guy says, "Course I am. I took out 9 men before breakfast. You think one pirate's gonna match me?" And Jack says, "I do. I'll do something sneaky and underhanded as soon as I think of it, mate." And then Jack pauses for a moment, and then he says, "I've thought of it." And he knocks the barrels loose, and the two of them go rolling on the barrels, and Jack says, "Though I might not count honesty among my natural strengths, I can count balance." And while the other guy falls off the rolling barrels, Jack is able to balance on the barrels as they're rolling out of the building, and the barrels smash right into the customs agent. And the customs agent says, "Help me, you lunks." And the workers say, "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." "Hey, that's Mr. Shelby's seal." And they pull out a letter from the customs agent's vest. And he says, "Give that back. That's official company business." And the workers say, "These are the documents Mr. Shelby was waving around when he left in the Carlo. He said he was making to report treachery to the company, and that our lots would improve for it. Honest man, Mr. Shelby. Figured he knew what he was on about. Treachery indeed. Look at here. It's evidence that Mr. Stewart here has been doctoring the finances, skimming all the share profits meant for us dockhands." And Jack says, "If I may, gentlemen, such fiscal blackdoggery is reprehensible to a pirate like myself, for whom fair shares and rake shakes are like rum to to a me. I should like to explain our involvement so I not be painted with that same brush of ignominy as the swindler." And the workers say, "Go ahead then." And Jack says, "Me crew and I happened upon the Carlo as she was sinking, her entire crew slaughtered. I discovered your belovedly honest Mr. Shelby pinned to the bulkhead by a cutlass I have no doubt was wielded by yon insentient at the behest of the embezzling Mr. Stewart." And the workers all turn to each other, and they turn back to Jack and say, "All right, you and your friends can leave. We'll crack open the canal locks for you. And I suspect we'll still find a use for these new gallows." And Jack then opens the door to where Gibbs, Anna Maria, and Marty are still kept, and he says, "Honesty, that's what I've been gifted. Honesty, filthy word." And Gibbs says, "Jack, you mean to say that you have to tell the truth whatever's asked until the sunset gives passage to the soul in your charge?" And Jack says, "I do." And Gibbs says, "That we could break open the mystery that is Captain Jack Sparrow?" And Jack says, "You could." And Gibbs says, "We could lay bare all the secrets of your past?" And Jack says, "We could, but you missed your window, mate." And they see the sun is already setting. And Anna Maria says, "I could stand to know less about Jack myself." And Jack says, "You keep telling yourself that, love." And that is the end of Banshee's Boon. So this comic revolves around Jack encountering a banshee in a sinking ship. The banshee manifests because the sailor dying in the ship's cabin is an Irishman. And Jack gives the sailor a drink right before he dies. Now, banshees, if you're unaware, are spirits popular in Irish myth and folklore that appear to warn of an impending death, and have a very distinctive wailing or shrieking sound they make. Now, this may be a very deep cut, but if you've ever seen the 1959 Disney film Darby O'Gill and the Little People, at the end of that film, there's a very famous scene where Darby O'Gill comes into contact with a banshee. By the way, if you've never seen that movie, I highly recommend it, especially if you love classic Disney movies. But anyway, because Jack gave this dying sailor comfort, the banshee blesses Jack with the dying man's greatest strength. As we come to find out, once Jack and the crew reach the canal lock in San Silvestri, Jack has been blessed with an incredible sense of honesty and is unable to lie. And because of this, he is actually able to then uncover an embezzling plot by the customs agent running the port, named Mr. Stewart. But I love the ending of this issue, as once Gibbs realizes Jack can only tell the truth, he wants to know all about Jack's adventures and what is actually true. Unfortunately, the Banshee's blessing only remains until sunset, and once he frees the crew from their cell, the sun has already begun to set. But that is the end of Banshee's Boon, and this brings us to the fourth and final published issue in the series, which is named Mother of Water. I really love this one, so let's dive right into it. So like the other comics, it begins with some narration that says, "Ask a pirate what they might do for treasure, and like enough you'll get a cry of anything and a kick in the shins. But though idle chatter may so attest, there be not many who would dare sail up the Los Pesadilla. Having heard tell of the horrors that await them, who would?" And then Jack says, "And that, Mr. Gibbs, is why you should never wear more than 6 petticoats at once, unless you are passably fluent in Dutch." And we see Jack and the crew are still on Anna Maria's family's boat, and they're sailing through a thick jungle. And Jack says, "Our map mentions as its principal landmark a stone bearing an uncanny resemblance to a roosting albatross, and I do believe we have now successfully arrived at said landmark." And Anna Maria says, "The beak's a bit too round." And Gibbs says, "Not exactly a perfect likeness." And Marty says, "I think it looks more like a big seagull." And Jack says, "I suspect it unlikely this god-forsaken stretch of river will yield a rock that looks more like an albatross than does this one." So the crew gets out of the boat, and Gibbs says, "I'm mighty glad we've got that map, Jack. These be dangerous waters." And Jack says, "The map does not strip him of danger, Mr. Gibbs, and neither does it offer us means to circumvent it." So keep to your toes, savvy? And we see a snake is slithering down the nearby branch and hisses at Jack. And we see out of nowhere a strange man comes and grabs the snake and puts it in his bag, leaving Jack and the crew completely stunned. And the guy sees them and says, "You're here to see her, aren't you?" And he just runs off. And Jack and the crew just stand there staring for a second, and Jack just says, "Right, let's go." And Gibbs says, "Jack, who is that?" And Jack says, "Haven't the foggiest." And Anna Maria says, "Might he be after our treasure?" And Jack says, "Looks to me like he was after snakes, love." And Marty says, "Why is he here? I thought even the local jungle tribe steered clear of this place." And Jack says, "You'd have to ask him, mate. All I know is that we are tantalizingly close to a treasure that will alter the fabric of our very existence." And Gibbs says, "And now that it's so near to hand, Jack, oughtn't you share with us the precise nature of this treasure for which you've had us risk life and limb by sailing up the dreaded Los Pasadilla and hiking its treacherous banks?" And Jack says, "In your many years of wide travels, Mr. Gibbs, have you ever heard lore and or legend pertaining to an object that would allow whatever scallywag has hold of it the ability to call upon the wind itself?" And Gibbs says, "You don't mean, it can't be." And Marty says, "What?" And Gibbs says, "The weather gauge?" And Jack says, "Precisely, Mr. Gibbs." And Gibbs says, "But Jack, the weather gauge ain't be seen for more than 100 years. And Jack says, "Good thing we've got this map then, eh?" And Gibbs says, "That thing has changed the course of history, Jack. Seen empires felled and fleets sunk beneath the waves, the Mongols and Koreans, the Spanish Armada. We'd see our throats slit 8 ways by breakfast were any to discover we so much as knew it existed, much less had it in hand." And Jack says, "Which I do hope explains me reluctance to breathe word of it before we were long shed of civilization." Anna Maria says, "We're not so shed as we might think, Jack. There's that scraggy-jawed snake catcher about, at least. Could be more where he came from." And Jack says, "That, love, is unlikely. This place boasts a richly earned reputation for being nigh unlivable. The Indians won't set up shop here anymore. The Spanish built a mission, but it weren't long before they lost all contact with their masters. A whole company of conquistadors was sent to find them, and they vanished likewise." And Marty says, "Then who was that guy?" And Jack says, "Naturally, the occasional explorer or lunatic will stumble into any forbidding tableau, even one as isolated as this. If our reptile enthusiast friend has, or rather had, any companions, then I suspect they are either long gone, or soon will be." And right when the group reaches the mission, they are caught off guard by a group of very, very malnourished conquistadors. And they're all pointing spears at Jack and the crew, and Jack says, "Then again, I could always be wrong." And we see the snake catcher guy from earlier come back, and he says, I told them you would come. It has been so long since any made the pilgrimage here. Welcome, welcome. We are so very glad you have come. Come, you have come to see her, not to talk with poor unworthy Sergei." And Jack says, "Her?" And Sergei says, "The mother of water, she who guides us with her benevolent rule." And Jack says, "Sergei, whilst I am all a twitter to learn more about this queen of yours to whom you make such fervent and frequent reference, I have another errand that is a titch more immediate, savvy?" And Sergei says, "Errand? And Jack says, "Just a worthless old bauble I need to pick up inside the old mission there." And Sergei says, "Mission? You mean the temple?" And Jack says, "Mission, temple, the stony place with the crucifixes, eh?" And Sergei says, Not yet. You must be prepared first. You cannot meet her as you are." And Sergei and Jack then walk up to the mission, and he turns around and says, "Two shakes, mates." And they go inside, and they see a bunch more of these malnourished conquistadors that are squeezing venom out of these snakes. And there's even snakes hanging up from the rafters all over the place. And Jack says, "Love what you've done with the place." And these guys pull off Jack's vest and shirt, and Sergei says, "The temple is a sacred place. We will not know if you are worthy until you have traversed its threshold." And one of the conquistadors begins to paint something on Jack's chest, and Jack says, "Have at it, mate. A true believer, that's Captain Jack. I can only express my sincere embarrassment as having left my own religious body paint at home." And then we see another conquistador come in, and he says, "What visitors we receive are rarely so acquiescent, though they know not the great honor they are to be afforded. We welcome you, stranger." And we see that this conquistador is the leader of the group. And Jack says, "Much obliged, mate. And as I am a wholeheartedly adherent to your cultish beliefs, whatever they may happen to be, I hope that I might demonstrate my religious devotion by, say, getting to know your temple and any of its nooks and crannies wherein a particular object might be hid. And we see the leader of the conquistadors grabs a little bowl of snake venom and begins to drink it. And Jack says, "Snake venom, is it? Never touched the stuff myself." Now, whilst I certainly wish to pay proper homage to whatever idol you lot clearly hold in such esteem, might I first inquire as to whether you've come across a disc placed about somewhere hereabouts? About so big, an arrow transfixing its face? Completely worthless, of course. Likely lowers the property value just having it about. And the leader says, "Know you how we came to find the Mother of Water?" And Jack says, "Seems to me that like enough has little to do with me disc, mate." And the leader says, "We were sent here many years ago. Another lifetime. Sent to find the men who built this place. But they were all dead, and we were sure to follow them. Driven nearly mad with hunger, fear, and fever, we sought sanctuary in the temple. We prayed for relief, and our prayers were answered, but not by the God to whom we made our supplications. The Mother of Water!" And all the other conquistadors shout, "The Mother of Water!" And the leader says, "She brought forth the spring that gives us life and sanctuary. She keeps away the predators that would make meals of us. Though we do our best to satisfy her, we are her unworthy congregation, and would not presume to make offerings of our bodies to her insatiable appetite. Thus, when men from the outside world make their way hither, we bring them to her chamber." And Jack says, "Oh, it's that sort of cult." And Sergei says, "Not all turn her lovely head. She deemed me unworthy of her embrace, and passed me by without a glance." And Jack says, "Can't imagine why, given how devilishly handsome you must appear to the ladies." So this Mother of Water, is she the sort to turn a mate's eye, pretty-like? And Sergei says, "Pretty cannot begin to describe her." And the leader says, "She is the most beautiful creature to ever move across the earth." And Jack says, "Well then, by all means, mate, chop chop. Mustn't keep a lady waiting." And Jack begins to follow the leader and Sergei down this hallway, and Jack says, "You know, gentlemen, this is not the first time I've found myself fancied by some wanton jungle chiefess. It's the gold, I'd wager. They can't resist a winning smile." But they emerge into the large main hall of the mission, and there's water all over the ground, and Jack says, "Not very romantic. Clammy. I'm not sure the drums and their accompanying spectators will do much for the mood either." And then right behind Jack, the Mother of Water shows herself, and we see it is a gigantic snake. And Jack says, "You're no lecherous jungle queen." And Sergei says, "I believe she is interested, my friend. Soon you will have the honor of joining the Mother." And Jack says, "Meaning eaten?" And Sergei says, "Of course." And the snake begins to circle around Jack. And Jack then jumps over the snake and whacks one of the drummers and grabs one of their broken swords and begins to fight the Mother of Water. But the leader of the conquistadors tackles Jack and says, "You would dare bring harm upon the Mother of Water?" And Jack says, "She started it, mate." And while Jack is looking up at the leader of the conquistadors, he sees behind him the disc that he's trying to find, which is up near the ceiling of the mission. And Jack punches the leader and he says, "I came here for one reason, and it was not to be offered up as a meal to a giant snake, savvy?" But then the Mother of Water wraps itself around Jack, and Jack still has that broken sword, and he stabs it right into the snake's eye. And in this moment, Jack jumps onto the vines across the room and climbs up to grab the disc he's trying to find. But once he grabs it, he sees the snake is making its way up to his location. So Jack figures out a plan really quickly, and he sees that there's a hole in the pillar that he's on. So what he does is he waits there and waits for the snake to go right through that hole, and Jack jumps off, and the snake gets trapped in that hole in the pillar. And when the snake breaks free, the whole entire mission begins to crumble down around Jack and all the people inside. And Jack barely makes it out before the entire building collapses, and Jack realizes that he is in the mouth of the Mother of Water, who is lying dead right next to him. Jack then goes over to free the crew who are in a makeshift cell in the jungle, and he scares off the rest of the conquistadors. And Gibbs says, "Entirely uninhabited, eh?" And Jack says, "Save your criticisms, Mr. Gibbs. After all, we got what we came for." And that is the end of Mother of Water. As I said at the beginning of this episode, this was the final issue in the series that was published, which unfortunately makes this the end of the series. But we finally figure out what Jack is looking for in this issue at least, and that is something called the weather gauge. This is an artifact that has the power to control the wind itself, and maybe more than that, although anything besides wind is never mentioned. Gibbs mentions the weather gauge hasn't been seen in over 100 years, and that it has destroyed countless empires throughout history. But while they're looking for it in this jungle, they see a strange man hunting snakes. And while Jack initially shrugs it off, they come in contact with a whole bunch of strange-looking malnourished conquistadors living in an overgrown Spanish mission. This mission actually happens to be where the certain item Jack is looking for is kept, and the strange man the crew saw earlier, whose name is Sergei, thinks Jack is here to see her. Her being the Mother of Water herself, which all of these conquistadors devote themselves to. These conquistadors were sent to find the priests who inhabited the mission, but they found them all long dead. But they did find the Mother of Water, which is a ginormous snake that lives in the waters of the sunken mission. Somehow these conquistadors survived all that time by drinking snake venom, and Jack is unwittingly being prepared as a sacrifice to the Mother of Water. And while Jack is facing the snake, he sees the artifact he's looking for up near the ceiling of the room they're in. So he uses the Mother of Water to his advantage and ends up bringing down the remains of the mission. This ends up killing the Mother of Water, and Jack is able to escape with the artifact he'd come for. Now, unfortunately, this thing Jack finds at the end here is never explained. You could assume it is the weather gauge, but since there was supposed to be 4 more issues in this series, I don't think Jack would have found it this early. On the last page, we get a good look at whatever this thing is, and it looks like a kind of compass. It's a round golden disc with a needle that I would assume spins like it would on a compass. But that's really all we can glean from this one look at it. Of course, the next issue was supposed to be named Our Man in Port Royal, and that probably would have explained what this thing is and how it relates to Jack's search for the weather gauge. While that is what I assume would have happened, it's definitely possible this thing could be the weather gauge, as Jack followed the map he got from Muddy to find this. That map he got in the first issue was what we were led to believe was a map leading to the weather gauge, so maybe this thing is actually that. But it is unconfirmed, and unfortunately, we will never know what would have happened in the other 4 planned issues in the series. I really wish this series was completed, but oh well. At least it ends on a somewhat satisfying note, and it isn't a massive cliffhanger, so that's always good. But that will do it for the Beyond Port Royal comics, and that brings us to the end of this episode. While it does suck this series was never finished, the 4 issues we do have are super fun. I love how it's set right after the Curse of the Black Pearl, and getting to see the rest of Anna Maria's family is also really, really cool. All in all, they are fantastic comics and well worth the read if you're a Pirates of the Caribbean fan. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you if you've left a rating or review wherever you listen to the podcast. It really means a lot to have so much support from so many people who also love Pirates of the Caribbean just as much as me. So thank you all once again. Next time, we'll be diving back into the theme park world to cover some lesser-known Pirates of the Caribbean-themed attractions, so stay tuned for that. It'll definitely be a fun episode, so make sure to come back next time for that. But for now, thank you once again for listening. This is the final episode of 2025, and it's been a fantastic year overall. Have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever you celebrate, and I'll see you in 2026 for more Pirates of the Caribbean fun. Have a Happy New Year. I'll see you next time. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram and Threads at Podcast of the Caribbean, and over on Twitter/X and Bluesky at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia, so make sure to check those platforms out. You can also buy merchandise for the podcast over on TeePublic and Dashery. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.